Hello again. Now, the Russia-Ukraine war is starting to impact on citizens. 2 residential buildings have caught fire last night from an intercepted Russian air attack. At least 137 people are reported to have been killed so far, among them soldiers and civilians. The South African government issuing a statement requesting Russia to withdraw its forces from Ukraine. And a short while ago, we saw President Matamela Cyril Ramaphosa calling for mediation and urging the United Nations Security Council to step up to stop this war. So what are the main risks to be posed to South Africa by this conflict that began yesterday, but it's been building up for months now? Let's discuss this with Dr. Kingsley Makhubela, Director of Risk Rekon. Dr. Makhubela, good afternoon, and thank you very much for your time. My first question to you will be this: the way the South African government has responded and commented on the Russia-Ukraine conflict, in your view, is it spot on? Is it on the right track?
Brother, thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity. You know, we often say war means the failure of diplomacy. By the time you have war, the horse has bolted. Now, how do you stop war? You can't immediately go to the negotiation table. One thing that you need to get is a ceasefire. And I heard on your program that Lavrov, it's actually saying to the Ukrainian, they must capitulate. Remember, capitulation also requires some level of negotiations. So the Russians are quite keen on the capitulation. They're legitimate security concerns, but then the Americans would have done the same. If roles were reversed, the American would have invoked what they call the Monroe Doctrine, which was framed by President Joseph Monroe in the 19th and 20th century. And they used the same rationale when the Soviets deployed missiles in Cuba, because not in their backyard. Now, how do we then allow the deployment of NATO in the backyard of the Russians? It raises security concerns for the Russians, and very legitimate security concerns, I must say, Raden, and which are not addressed by the existence of NATO. NATO remains, in my own view, an instrument of the Cold War during the post-Cold War era. After the collapse of the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union, why do we still need NATO, and why the expansion to the east? Those are the things that are causing what we call the security dilemma. Of course, compounded by what happened in the last few years, the US unilaterally withdrawing from the ballistic missile treaty. So it raises concern, and security concern, and rightfully so, on the Russian side.
Okay, so the way South Africa is responding, if I may have your views on that, President Matamela Cyril Ramaphosa calling on the United Nations Security Council to step up its efforts for mediation?
Mediation has been going on in that conflict since 2014, Raden. When the Russians seized a larger part of the Crimea, it was because of the breakdown of negotiation and mediation. There's been a lot of mediation. The Germans tried to mediate, but the Americans have always been keen, Raden, to send military equipment to the Ukrainian government, to arm the Ukrainian government, to some extent to the annoyance of the Germans and the French, who were intricately involved in the mediation of the conflict. So the mediation now, remember, mediation, you don't rule it out in any given process of the conflict. But the Russians have made it quite clear that what they require now is a total disarmament of Ukraine. They want to remove that threat that is posed by the Ukraine, and they are willing to enter into negotiation. From what I've seen in the media, the Russians say they have no interest to become an occupying power in Ukraine. But the concerns of the Russian ought to be addressed. The manner in which the West dealt with the Russian, it's quite unfortunate. Kicked out the Russian out of the G8 countries. And yet, if they've kept the Russians within the G8, they would have had a better platform for interaction to deal with some of these global challenges. But the hawks in Washington are not quite keen around that.
Yeah. So now the war is underway. The conflict has escalated. From a South African perspective, what are the main risks? I mean, we know that in terms of business, there are billions of rand locked up in Russia in terms of South African companies. We export vegetables and fruit like citrus to Russia. Both Russia and Ukraine combined supply the world, and especially Africa, with anywhere between 25 and 30% of wheat. We buy some of our wheat, and that's from the... So what are the other risks that we would be facing as a country that's got historically close ties with Russia and Ukraine, and currently we have South Africans who are in those countries, including we have an embassy, a full embassy in Kiev. What are the risks for us?
Well, the risks, except outside the human life, the economic risks are quite huge. As you know, the price of oil now is expected to go above $100 per barrel. It would hit our pocket so heavily in terms of that. In terms of the movement of goods and services around the world, it would impact on that, because it seems the encirclement of Russia it's continuing. It's the same policy that the US is pursuing with respect to China, and it affects the logistics. I mean, if you look at the logistics, and China is the biggest producer in terms of a lot of equipment, electronics, but the movement has been impacted by the behavior of the US, and it's going to affect us quite definitely. But I think Russia is a major role player in global politics. I don't see any reason for keeping Russia in the long run in the cold, because the more you keep the Russians in the cold, and the more it poses a serious threat to global security. I think the world has to come to the round table to discuss the new security architecture outside NATO, which has become part of the problem now, given the fact that the Cold War era has basically disappeared. So those things are going to affect everyone in the world, because Russia is a major player, of course, as I said. And we have an interest also in Ukraine. We have good relations with Ukraine. It's going to affect the goods and services, and the trade, little trade that we are having with Ukraine. It will be impacted by this.
Thank you.
And at the time when we've had serious major problem with respect to COVID impact.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kingsley Makhubela. We have some of your insights. He's, of course, from Risk Rekon, giving us some of his analysis about how likely South Africa might be impacted, the rest of the world, giving very interesting insights about his view is that you can't leave Russia out in the cold globally. It's time now that they are brought back to the table. Yeah, remember, they were part of the G8, and then they were expelled, and then became the G7. So Russia is like out there on its own limb, according to Dr. Makhubela, but that's not sustainable. Thank you very much for your time. Now, let's